praise. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me ever to adore thee. May I still thy goodness prove, while the hope of endless glory fills my heart with joy and love. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus on me when I stranger, wandering from the fold of God, he to rescue me from danger, interpose his precious blood. Oh, to grace, how great a debtor, daily unconstrained to be. Let thy goodness, like a fetter, bind me closer still to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave thy God I love. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above. Amen. Our next hymn will be hymn 478, Sweet Hour of Prayer. Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, that calls me from a world of care.
morning. Welcome to Country Life this morning. We're happy everyone is here. Good to see you, Mr. Bedford, always. This morning we have a special presentation by Buc Gendke. He has some special prophecy to share with us. But before we begin, let's have a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you so much that we can be here together. We ask that you would please send your Spirit to us and bless us this day. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, thank you very much. When Marianne asked me to speak on this, I did not realize how much of a machete I was going to have to take to this to get it down to 20 minutes. So we're going to dig right in to get as much in as possible because I had to cut quite a bit out. So when you look at the reasons to leave the city through the spirit of prophecy, it really comes down, you can really boil it down into three kind of categories. You have the health hazards of the city. This is pretty common sense, true in any age. Simply, it's more healthy to live in the country than it is in the city. Then you have the spiritual influences. And then this is true in any age. The more people you're around by very nature, the more sinners you're going to be around, so the more influenced you can be negatively to that regard. And then the third reason is end-time events, and you can kind of break this up into two categories. You've got economic and judgments from God. And that's where we'll spend most of the time this morning, because we just didn't have time to cover all of it. But here's a quote that's interesting. While appearing to the children of men as the great physician who can heal all their maladies, he will bring disease and disaster until populous cities are reduced to ruin and desolation. Even now he's at work. He imparts the air a deadly taint, and thousands perish by pestilence. These visitations are to become disastrous. So I thought this was an interesting way to start it off, just given the nature of what's going on today with the virus in the air. But I wanted to highlight, she does mention populous cities, and if you study her works when she talks about destruction at the end of time, she always has a special focus on cities and what happens in those cities. After leaving Sodom was the result of the wicked associations while there. The sense of right and wrong was confused in their minds, and sin did not as pure as sin to them. This is probably, at least to me, one of the scarier quotes I think I've read, because here you have Lot's daughters doing something horrible right afterwards, and yet they absolutely didn't think it was actually sin. It didn't dawn on their minds what they were doing as sin. And the reason why I say it's scary is I believe of sin, and that same delusion can come upon us. And what is it in my life, maybe who am I around, that's blinding me to the sins that maybe I don't see as sin? And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, this is a famous prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem that Jesus made during his lifetime. Ellen White actually talks about this in Great Controversy when she says, when the idolatrous standards of the Romans should be set up on holy ground, which extend some furlongs outside the city walls, then the followers of Christ were to seek to find safety in flight. Essentially what happened was the Romans had a siege on Jerusalem. The siege ultimately failed, and they retreated. The Jews chased them and actually had a couple victories thereafter. But the Christians recognized the sign and fled to the mountains. About 3 years later, the Romans came back and had their successful siege and killed millions of people. But now you may be asking, what does this have to do with out of the cities? Well, Ellen White has a quote where she utilizes the destruction of Jerusalem as to get out of the cities. She says, as the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman armies was the signal for flight to the Judean Christians, so the assumption of power on the part of our nation in the decree enforcing the papal Sabbath will be a warning to us. It will then be time to leave the large cities, preparatory to leaving the smaller ones for retired homes in secluded places among the mountains. Most Adventists And growing up in the church, I always found that extremely confusing because it flies in the face of everything else that she says. If you read anything about the cities, it just doesn't seem to mesh with the other comments. And as I studied it further, I began to realize that's not what it actually says. It says there's an assumption of power on a part of our nation. Most take that to mean a decree, an actual Sunday law, but what does it actually mean? Well, she uses that exact same phrase in another spot. She said, assumption of power on the part of God's chosen people. Those who take their orders from Christ must not seek to compel others to obey the law of Jehovah. So it's not about passing a law. It's merely seeking to compel. Just attempting to do it is an assumption of power. And she goes as far to say as we shouldn't even do it to try to force people, or seek to compel people, I should say, to actually keep God's laws, which are correct. So then we have to ask ourselves the question, has our nation ever sought to compel, via a Sunday law, in our nation's history? And the answer is yes. It occurred in 1888. There's a politician by the name of Blair, a group called the National Reform Movement, which was a big group that really pushed for national Sunday laws. There was lots of state laws, but there was never a national Sunday law. We actually sent delegates to argue against this law. Ultimately, it failed at the very end of 1888. And then notice what Ellen White says immediately after that. We must show the world that we recognize the events that are now taking place in connection with the national reform movement, the fulfillment of prophecy. That which we have for the last 30 or 40 years proclaimed would come is now here. And the trumpet of every watchman upon the walls of Zion should raise the alarm. Now, what's interesting is you can almost break this into two parts. There's the fulfillment of prophecy. Failed attempt. It was still a fulfillment. And then look at the imagery that she uses. Trumpets of watchmen on Zion. Zion is another word for Jerusalem. You know, these trumpeters, they would watch for oncoming armies, blow the alarm. It's the same imagery that you would have with the siege of Jerusalem. And then also what's interesting is, remember, what was the actual warning to get out of Jerusalem for the Jews? Was it a successful siege? No, it was a siege that actually failed. It wasn't successful. So they used as the sign to actually get out. And you'll notice in her writings post-1888, she's very clear about her messaging as far as getting out of the cities. He required everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to be given the mark on the right hand or on the forehead. And no one could buy or sell anything without that mark, which was either the name of the beast or the number representing his name. Now this, of course, is talking about the mark of the beast. We know that to be the Sunday law and then not being able to buy or sell. But notice what Ellen White says. Again and again, the Lord has instructed that our people are to take their families away from the cities into the country where they can raise their own provisions. For in the future, the problem of buying and selling will be a very serious one. Well, what problem of buying and selling? It's the problem right above. So look what she's doing. She's giving us, the Lord in his wisdom and mercy is giving us a hedge to protect ourselves from this time period by going into the country, by growing some of your own provisions, to allow you to protect yourself a little bit from that time. That doesn't mean you can prep your way out of the last days, but it can help hedge against some of that persecution that goes on. And also, think about this in relation to the time to leave the cities. If you read that and said, oh, gee, I'm not supposed to leave the cities or do anything until the Sunday law happens, could you do this? Grow provision? No, because by the time, the Sunday law happened, it's time to move to the country. Oh, wait, I can't buy land. I can't do anything. You're stuck. End-time economics. All right, so the Lord calls for his people to locate away from the cities. For in such hour as you think not, fire and brimstone will be rained from heaven upon these cities. Proportionate to their sins will be their visitation. When one city is destroyed, let not our people regard this matter as a light affair, and think that they may, if favorable opportunity offers, build themselves homes in that same destroyed city. Now this is interesting because this gives a little bit of the cadence of the destruction. Because notice what she's saying. There's going to be destruction, but don't think that to go and buy land there, because this is really kind of the time of the end. But could you do this after the Sunday law? No, you can't. Sunday law. And I don't know if it maybe fire and brimstone, asteroids, whatever, comes down and hits some cities, and maybe that's the first set of destructions. I don't know. But there's some set of destruction that happens in the cities prior to the Sunday law. And we need to recognize that not as an opportunity for monetary gain, like, oh, look, there's beachfront property I can now buy on the cheap, but to recognize it for what it is, a sign of the end times. Men in responsible positions will not only the Sabbath themselves, but from the sacred desk will urge upon the people the observance of the first day of the week. Pleading tradition and custom in behalf of this man-made institution, they will point to the calamities on land and sea, to the storms of wind, the floods, the earthquakes, the destruction by fire, as judgments indicating God's displeasure because Sunday is not sacredly observed. Again, lots of destruction going on, and it's blamed on what? Not keeping Sunday sacred. But then she crystallizes it in this. Calamities which fill the land are the result of Sunday breaking, so very similar to above. Thinking to appease the wrath of God, influential men make laws enforcing Sunday observance. So this gives us, again, that cadence. You have to force people to actually have their consciences forced into keeping Sunday. This is a long one, so forgive me. For years, Jesus labored to convince the Jews that the great calamities would come upon their nation unless they should repent. Christ pronounced woes that would come upon Jerusalem. To the blind priest and unbelieving Pharisees, he spoke words of entreaty, but denounced the wickedness of their course. The disciples were amazed at his words. They could not see how they could possibly be fulfilled. As they looked upon the massive stones and their beautiful grand to them, that the structure must stand forever. Was this not the opinion of the inhabitants of San Francisco entertained regarding their grand towering structures and the probability of their destruction? Read the whole 24th chapter of Matthew. The Lord we know is near at the door, and we must move carefully in the Lord's way. Christ has warned us of the judgments that will come upon the cities because the inhabitants have greatly dishonored God. Now is our opportunity to warn the world that the end of all things is at hand. This is interesting because that's what's going to happen in the cities. So she's taking a prophetic chapter and pointing it and saying, this is what's going to happen in the cities. So I looked that up out of curiosity. What was the event? And it was the earthquake of 1906. 80% of the city was destroyed and left about 75% of the population of San Francisco homeless. So Ellen White actually traveled through there, and she said this: San Francisco in ruins, the most complete, thorough, awful calamity that I've ever looked upon. In the night season, I have had many presentations of this, and now I can understand better the real meaning of the scenes I have witnessed. So what she's saying here is God has showed me numerous times. This is the closest I've ever seen to that, what I've seen in the vision. And then if you start to think about it, put that in today's context. Can you imagine New York being 80% destroyed, 75% of the population homeless, Chicago, Houston, any of those places? And then there's one big change from any of the destruction we've seen. What's the reason for this destruction? Well, it's your fault, right? That's the reason. They're blaming you. Why? Because this is your fault. So can you imagine living in a city being destroyed to this scale, 80%, 75% homeless, and how would you think you'd be treated? You'd be running into people every day with all their means of income taken away, all their possessions taken away, their families maybe died in the destruction that happened. I think they're going to be pretty upset at you. Quite a bit upset. I mean, we've seen lately there's been some riots and things, and I think those are, compared to this, pretty way down in JV, not even coming up on the radar of what you would see with this. Just if you imagine the destruction going on there. Let all who understand the meanings of these things read the 11th chapter of Revelation. Read every verse and learn the things that are yet to take place in the cities. Read also the scenes portrayed in the 18th chapter of the same book. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that ye may not be partakers in her sins, and that you receive not of her plagues. It will not to be to the credit of any who believe the word of the prophecies of this book, to ignore the special indications of God and show indifference in regard to this wonderful display of power of God because of the sins of this recently destroyed city. So here, taking it what's going to take place in the cities. So those are prophetic chapters, obviously. But she's saying there's a dual application. It'll give you a picture of what's going to happen in the cities. And then she's also saying, don't show indifference to the destruction of San Francisco. Recognize this as what's coming on the world and get out of the way. You know, what happened with Lot? Did he stay in Sodom and the fire and brimstone all come down and then he just walk out and was okay? Did the people of Jerusalem stay in Jerusalem and the siege happened and everything was destroyed and they were just fine and lived? No, they were saved because they listened to the warning of God. In the future, the cities will certainly feel the terrible results of the earthquakes and fires. Cities will be destroyed by flood and by lightnings. Out of the cities is my message at this time. Again, very consistent. The time is near when large cities will be swept away, and all should be warned of these coming judgments. Oh, that God's people had a sense of impending destruction of thousands of cities, now almost given to idolatry. So this is interesting because you add and you see thousands. Well, thousands is at least 2,000. And I don't know if you've ever thought about how long, when you've imagined the end time events, how long is that all going to take? From when it really starts to, finishing, how long is it? Is it a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years? Well, if you could be Switzerland and watch your news every morning, and if it was 1 year, assuming only 2,000 cities, the minimum required for this, every day you would wake up in a year on average to almost 6 cities, 6 of the world's largest cities being destroyed. If this was a 3-year event, every day 2 cities, roughly about 2 cities would be destroyed. If this was 5 years, so this was going on for 5 years, which I can't even honestly imagine that going on that long. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's a long time. You'd still wake up every day to on average 1 city, little over 1 city being destroyed. And whose fault is it? Your fault. I can't even imagine the level of destruction going on. We've had examples of that with Katrina, destroying New Orleans. But there was a big difference there, wasn't there? New Orleans was destroyed, but what happened? Well, there wasn't anything after that. The nation sent a bunch of help in there and tried to help as much as they could. It was still terrible. Those people went through a whole lot. But how much help do you think these people are going to have in the cities with thousands of cities being destroyed? If one day New York gets destroyed, and then the next day Chicago, and then the next day Tokyo, the next day Houston, and I mean it's all over the world. This is a global thing. How much help is going to be going to those cities? Well, they're not going to be able to get any help. Because why? There's so much confusion and chaos. Every time a leader turns around, there's another major city being destroyed. You're not getting any help. And again, if you're in there and you happen to be a Christian and not keep Sunday sacred, how are you going to be treated? I mean, there's going to be people dying by thirst, by hunger, because they don't have anything. And the rage, the utter hatred that would be coming towards you, I can't even fathom. I can't even put that into words, what kind of persecution someone in this environment would have. And that's why God has told us, escape, get out of the way, to hedge yourself against some of these things. When God's restraining hand is removed, the destroyer begins his work. Then in our cities, the greatest calamities will come. Is this because the people of God do not keep Sunday? No, but because men have trampled upon the law of Jehovah. This is again reinforcing the idea of why were the cities destroyed and what people think they were destroyed for versus why they really were destroyed. But ere long, there will be such strife and confusion in the cities that those who wish to leave them will not be able. We must be preparing for these issues. This is the light that has been given me. So what she's saying here is there's going to be a time, if you don't heed these warnings, where you won't have a chance to get out because of the strife that's going on. There will be very, I would imagine, brutal based on what she's describing here. If our people regard God's instruction as a value, they will move away from the city, so that they will not be pained by its revolting sights, and that their children will not be corrupted by its vices. Those who choose to remain in the cities, surrounded by the houses of unbelievers, must share in the disaster that will come upon them. When the Lord was about to speak, he said to Moses, "Behold, tomorrow, about this time, I will cause it to rain a very grievous hail, such as hath not been seen in Egypt since the foundation thereof until now. Send therefore now, and gather thy cattle, and all that thou hast in the field, for upon every man and beast that shall be found in the field, and shall not be brought home, the hail will come down upon them, and they shall die." So this is very clear. If you choose to ignore the warning, if you choose to live there, you're going to have disasters come upon you. And I'm not suggesting, and I don't know that she was either in this last part talking about the death, because that was talking about what happened in Egypt. I don't know that you're going to die during that time period or not with those disasters hitting the city. But if you live, again, you have nothing. Your family, you're going to run into everybody that you're running into. All their stuff has been destroyed. Their family may have died. They are starving. They're thirsty. And it's your fault. That is just powerful to me and speaks to the need and the urge to actually be active in obeying God's commands. Now, this may be or come off as kind of depressing and things because you see what's going to take place. I personally look at this because I just didn't have the time. Warned the Christians and warns us to get out of the cities to avoid these things. And we know from the previous slides when that occurred, which was 1888. So we are 130 plus years removed from the warning to avoid those judgments coming upon the cities, which tells me Christ is ever at the door, because we are past Noah, which was the longest warning. Noah's warning was 120 years. We're 131 at this point. We are ever at the warning. And the reason why this, even though this is terrible, but the reason why it's exciting is because the start of this is the beginning of the end, where we get to God and heaven and we can be with him forever, which is really the miracle that we want.
Thank you for sharing with us this morning. I know you could talk a lot longer, a lot more to share. It's now time to divide for our Sabbath school classes. We have the sanctuary class.